Having me on, and I definitely think it was. But if we really want to cut through it all, the trade war and tariffs, I really think that's just kind of a ruse for the overall negotiation that President Trump is attempting to effect here. We all know that it's not the biggest issue. There are many other greater issues that are at play here. So I think these cutbacks and these non-escalation clauses are all good things, but that's not the real deal. The real deal is much deeper and more broad than that.
One of the driving factors, at least in these considerations, are domestic concerns. Pork prices, for example, were a big factor. There's been a ripple effect based on a shortage of that meat supply. There's been a ripple effect on the price of other meats. Do you think cuts like these will ease things for Chinese consumers?
I think they will, and in that regard, members of the international community perceive them as being more self-serving than just, we've decided to do this out of the goodness of our hearts. Soya is needed. The herd has been culled by perhaps a third because of the African swine fever, and I do think it's going to have a positive effect, yes.
Beyond China, what countries and sectors are benefiting from Monday's announcement?
I'd be hard-pressed. I mean, the international supply chain has already somewhat reconfigured itself in an effort to continue to supply China, given the reticence of the U.S. and the escalation of this trade war. So I think that's pretty much been sorted out. To me, again, the bigger issue is you can throw out things like, I think the tariffs are a relatively minor issue. This currency manipulator status, forget about that. There's really no legitimacy to it. Something like, the trade surplus that going away, that's not going to happen. I think the real issues that President Trump is trying to negotiate for have to do with forced technology transfer, IP theft, SOE in certain industries being subsidized. So I think all these other things are kind of just the foreplay and the backdrop to what he would like to see to be a very meaningful conversation with Mr. Xi about these larger issues.
Okay, so about these larger issues, I have to ask you, Nouriel Roubini, a former Clinton economic advisor, wrote in The Guardian on Monday that Trump's lack of a strategic vision, as it's called in there, in terms of tariffs, in terms of Beijing, will ultimately make Beijing great again. Is he right?
I think that's a really interesting take, Roee, and I appreciate you bringing it up. He may very well be. But I'll mention two things. One is, I think President Trump will go down in history as a strategic disruptor. So disruption is absolutely his calling card. But number two, it's been very interesting to see other facets of the international community get behind populist Trump in multilateral initiatives. I'm talking about the European community and their stance vis-a-vis China. So unintentionally, you might say, this isolationist, this populist president that wants to keep America great now has somehow rallied other countries behind him, and certainly he didn't set out to do that. I believe strongly that some of the leadership void, some of the lack of advocacy for multilateral institutions has certainly evolved into China's orbit, and some of it rightfully so based on its economic power. But I want to make one other point here, Roee, that I think is really important. We talk about products, we talk about goods. Let's not forget services. Financial services are huge. I mean, you make a lot more money in financial services than you do importing or exporting coal. And China opening up its market to financial services, but at the same time exporting financial services. I don't know if you're aware of this, but 25% of the initial public offerings, the IPOs on the stock exchanges in NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange this year were from Chinese companies. And about 10% of the capital raised in all the IPOs in 2019 were mainly led from Asia following these Chinese companies. So services is a huge area. I think China is doing its part by opening that up. I think Chinese companies are coming here and taking capital from underwriters and NASDAQ sponsors like our firm, Boustead Securities. And I think we got to keep that in mind because we are shifting to a services economy. China has shown more than any country in recent history how they've been successfully able to rebalance.